up in the late 90s or early 2000s, you'll probably remember Naughty Dog's iconic PS1 title, Crash Team Racing. It's got something for every Crash Bandicoot fan: an amazing selection of tracks, an insanely replayable story mode, deep mechanics, and an unforgettable cast of characters. However, this game also has a huge secret. Some of its tracks feature the most broken shortcuts I've ever seen in a racing game. Over the last 2.5 decades, there's been a dedicated community that's turned destroying its courses into an art form. Their discoveries didn't just change their strategies, they completely changed the game's speedrunning scene forever. This is the story of Crash Team Racing's most iconic ultra shortcuts. So before I start the video, I'm sure you're wondering, what even is an ultra shortcut? Well, to answer that, we'll be using Mario Kart Wii as an example. It used a pretty rudimentary checkpoint system where each track is broken up into segments of invisible lines. Here, the lines in green are a series of key checkpoints that the player has to pass through in order for the rest of the lap to count. The way that ultra shortcuts worked in that game is that they broke the track's progression by allowing you to skip the first key checkpoint and go all the way to the end of the track. That said, the tracks that we'll be going over became broken in their own special ways. Most of these shortcuts were likely discovered in the PAL version of the game's Time Trials mode, and there's a really interesting explanation as to why. In this version, one unlockable character named Penta Penguin had completely maxed out stats, which was done intentionally as a joke. In the NTSC version, however, he has the same stats as Polar and Pura, low top speed and acceleration, but a really tight turning radius. Unlike the Time Trials mode, where you have an unlimited character selection, the most viable choices for Adventure mode speedruns are Tiny and Digodile, because of their extremely high speed stat. Before we dive into the run, let's go over some of the game's movement techniques to make everything easier to follow. The most crucial and widely used piece of movement tech throughout a speedrun is a turbo boost, performed by pressing either the R1 or L1 shoulder button, steering left and right, and pressing the opposite shoulder button to start the next mini-turbo. For example, by holding R1 to start drifting and pressing L1 to start the next mini-turbo, your next MT will be stronger than the one before it. Each time you do a drift, you can get up to 3 MTs, with the last one being the strongest. In order to get the most amount of speed from each mini-turbo, wait for the gauge at the bottom to fill all the way. You'll know if you've got a good mini-turbo if you see the inside of your character's exhaust pipes transition from black to white. Building a solid boost isn't exactly frame perfect or difficult to perform consistently, but getting the timing down will take some practice. Next, a good visual indicator for how much speed you can earn is the flames at the back of your car. For example, by executing 3 mini-turbos, you build up the first level of speed, known as yellow fire. Next, turbo pads and jumps over 150 units on the jump meter give you the second level of speed, known as sacred fire. Ideally, this is the baseline for the level of speed you want to keep throughout each race. Arsène and Bourwawe, 2 French players who discovered the mechanic between 2000 and 2004, will likely be mentioned later on in the video. They not only discovered the fire mechanic, but also several shortcuts on other tracks that have become essential in both time trials and full game runs. If you'd like to learn more about Sacred Fire and its history, this thread here has a lot of information. By constantly performing boosts and going over turbo pads, you build up reserves, which is a sort of invisible meter that keeps track of your overall speed. An important thing to note about reserves, and by extension mini-turbos, is that every frame where a mini-turbo is being charged corresponds with how much reserves you get, meaning the end goal is to have as many full mini-turbos as possible. Maintaining a high amount of reserves means that you'll be able to keep the speed you gain from performing them, with the added bonus that some shortcuts will be easier to perform. By maintaining your reserves, you'll keep that speed the entire time. This mechanic was likely discovered extremely early on, around the time PlayStation emulators became available, and when players began reverse engineering the game's source code, but it's not clear when research about it began to circulate. And now for the more advanced movement techniques. One of them is what's known as a speed ghost, SG for short, which usually happens because of a realistic quirk in the game's physics engine. Going down a sloped surface will temporarily give you a huge speed increase, and the most optimal way to take advantage of that speed boost is by performing turbo drifts. Think of an SG like a skateboarder entering a half pipe or a ghost pushing you down a hill. The next advanced technique is called frogging, which top-level runners typically perform to preserve the remaining speed as they're losing it. Frogging is an extremely necessary strategy due to the speed from SGs gradually depleting each frame when you're on the ground. However, it's best not to jump too often. Every 5 jumps you make while you're at your base speed costs you a frame. Finally, there's U-turning, performed by pressing the brake button and turning hard to either the left or right. This is typically done to give yourself the correct alignment, allowing you to perform a handful of the shortcuts that we'll go over here in a bit. But let's stop revving our engines before we run out of gas. Here's how speedrunners completely destroy this game's tracks. As with any speed game where movement preservation is essential, the first 10 years of Crash Team Racing's competitive history really set the stage for the time trials and any percent speedrunning scenes. If you ever watch modern world record attempts from top-level runners like HypnoShark, it's nearly impossible to not notice these tricks in some capacity. The first 2 ultra shortcuts that we'll be going over were found sometime after the game's international release on October 20th, 1999. They made an appearance in a Japanese strategy guide. Up first, Papu's Pyramid is the 3rd course in the adventure mode's second hub world. It starts out with some pretty tight turns around a pyramid, a wide turn flanked by a large grassy hill and massive Venus flytraps, a huge slope pillar serving as the level's intended shortcut, a massive stone staircase, and a wide U-turn that experienced players can fly across. However, it's not actually the biggest skip on this track, but we'll get to that soon. What the Japanese community found is that by jumping on this wall at the base of the pyramid, then back onto the bridge at the start of the race, and then onto the border of the straightaway below, you could load just enough of the finish line to land behind it and count the lap. Novice runners could still use the U-turn as a safe fallback option, however, taking the wall would save a lot more time. The other shortcut that was discovered around this time was on Oxide Station, one of the last tracks in the game. In the adventure mode, you have to complete it twice, once as a normal race, and then again to defeat the game's final boss, Nitrous Oxide. Around the turn of the century, players discovered that by gaining air off this slope and pulling hard to the left, you could jump over the side and land on the track far below, cutting off the section with the low gravity and super turbo pads. This skip actually became so popular that it appeared in a Japanese commercial for the game. Sometime between 2000 and 2004, Arsene's discoveries began melting Polar Pass's world records. After the figure 8 section with the frozen polar bear, there's a bunch of small islands with turbo pads on them that you need to jump across. Experts of this track already knew that if you had enough speed, you could jump from the first turbo pad to the bridge, but that was about to change. Arsene's new skip became known as Boomerang. In order to perform it, you need to build up a lot of speed at the start of the race and align yourself perfectly with this downward-facing slope here. From there, you jump off the slope section of the track and do a nearly frame-perfect second jump off the lip of the wall to gain a lot of height. If you did everything correctly, you'll clear the fence and land hard on the bridge below. In 2005, a handful of new techniques found on Oxide Station would set existing world records on a crash course at the bottom of the leaderboards. The first 2 shortcuts used in current time trial runs were discovered by a runner named Scandu, and involved turning around near the starting line, jumping onto the wall, and clinging on for dear life before dropping down onto the track below. Here, the visual indicator is this specific light-colored section of the wall. From here, you want to jump onto it and fall off to the left as soon as you see the mouth of the tunnel below. Simply look for this other light-colored section of the border below and to the right of the tunnel with the super turbo pads. You'll want to drive past the mouth of the tunnel for a tiny bit, then perform a 90-degree U-turn to the right, allowing you to land on this section underneath you. Over the years, Scandu's 2 skips and the shortcut found by Japanese players would become the defining meta for this track in world record runs, particularly since it turned one of the game's most intimidating boss fights into a walk in the park. One runner named Thomas60 incorporated strategies similar to the ones Scandu had found into one of his runs. Although Thomas didn't take the same lines as Scandu, it became pretty clear how exploitable the track's verticality truly was. It's important to note that even if you can only do one of the skips that I've talked about, you'll finish the race well ahead of Oxide, and Crash and his friends can live the rest of their lives as champions of the universe. Not long after, in June of 2006, Hot Air Skyway's popularity would start to inflate like a balloon. In the game's adventure mode, it's one of the last courses in the game before facing Pinstripe and Oxide on their respective home tracks. One of the first major skips for this track was actually found by our old friend Thomas60. After the first set of item boxes, you drive under the blimp to load the spiral much further on in the track, and then immediately turn around. Performing a turbo while avoiding the racers will give you enough speed to clear the large gap and jump back onto the course. After that, start a drift until you see the super turbo pad with the intended shortcut off to the left, then aim for the end of this fence and jump off the side. This shortcut is especially difficult to pull off, because you need to avoid the racers coming at you, hug just enough of the end of the fence that the game doesn't consider you out of bounds, and gain enough distance from your jump to aim for the lower half of this ramp. Performing the trick correctly will let you get a really good SG and plenty of speed. Otherwise, you're skydiving straight into the abyss. Once again, this quickly became one of the most pivotal strats used in any percent speedruns, since you could use it to breeze through the boss battle. Another strategy that became crucial for good time trial runs was once again found by Arsene, and needs quite a bit of setup. You drive along the left side of the track, then froggy and turn around just as you're approaching the end of the fence. Jumping along the invisible wall makes it act as a small ramp, which will give you just enough air to align yourself properly with the center of the track. After that, perform another turbo, jump, then do a sharp U-turn while jumping over the barrier. It is fairly easier to perform with speed items, but in an any percent race, you don't always have that luxury. This track might not be exactly like Rainbow Road, but if you're not careful, it's certainly more than capable of deflating any chance you had at a world record. Fast forward to 2008, where Tiny Arena's Muddy Motorways would be massacred. For many years in the time trials community, it's been infamous for likely having the most potential shortcuts in the entire game. Due to its walls having extremely odd geometry, many fans of the course compare it to Mario Kart 64's Wario Stadium, known for its infamous lap skips. The first ultra shortcut for this course was found by a runner named Nyklas. However, despite the plethora of other skips found on the track that likely came before it, this one was the first to have surviving video viewable on YouTube. Sure, it's a bit crude, but it gets the point across of how experienced players could simply glide over the walls. However, as we'll soon find out, Nyklas's ultra shortcut was only the beginning of the community's complete domination of this track. And for nearly another decade, there weren't really that many new discoveries. The hungry beast that was the CTR speedrunning scene lay dormant, waiting for more tracks to unload its collective knowledge onto. But if you've been part of a community for any popular speed game, you'll know that every now and then, something comes along that rocks everyone's world. Especially for games as old as CTR, there's always potential to lower the time even further. In the years to come, tracks would be destroyed like never before. An entire gauntlet of shortcuts would emerge, some having the capability of completely killing a run. Welcome to the Ultra Shortcut Renaissance. On August 28th of 2018, an Italian CTR fan page made a post about a groundbreaking discovery, a new tool-assisted speedrun of Papu's Pyramid, published by a player named Tiziano. For those of you who've never heard of him, he's known on several Crash Bandicoot forums as Aku96, but most people know him on YouTube as Alessandro Mastroianni. He's particularly well known for his incredible guides, explaining the different shortcuts and techniques that time trialers use. As a quick side note, for the people in my audience who aren't familiar with what a task is, it's essentially a computer playing a video game perfectly. They're created by a series of scripts written by players and programmers that tell the computer to make precise inputs or button presses every single frame, in order to beat a game as quickly as possible. Task creators use special emulators like BizHawk that allow them to view values in the game's memory like speed, the player's specific angle, and of course, reserves, which can influence the direction of the speedrun they're creating. The wealth of knowledge that task creators can gain from these emulators is often shared with other top-level players to find strategies that maybe hadn't been considered before. It's hard to properly convey how important the task that he made truly was. It was the first time in 10 years that a new ultra shortcut had been found, and nearly 20 for this particular track. Prior to the article being released, Alessandro had been working on improving a script for the game originally created by a fellow task programmer named Lapone36. Through fortune and curiosity, he discovered that you could beat the entire race in only a few seconds. Welcome to Triple Tiziano. The main exploit used in the shortcut, known as the No Man's Zone, is extremely technical and hard to pull off, given the skip its notoriously high skill ceiling. Even setting it up is difficult, requiring small, precise inputs and just the right amount of speed to stay on top of the wall. Before you can even try and pull off the shortcut, you need to be facing the bottom track at an angle, jump in a precise way to avoid going out of bounds, and have just enough momentum to jump off the bridge and onto the wall. Obviously, the programmers didn't intend for players to be able to do this, so the walls have a bad habit of bucking the player off. But if that wasn't hard enough, you have to jump off the very edge of the wall while performing a mid-air U-turn, and have enough speed to land at a target that's not much larger than your character. What's crazy is that Alessandro found it entirely by accident, using save states to figure out exactly where the game would and wouldn't let you land to get the lap to count. The reason the exploit is named No Man's Zone comes from the fact that in order to get the lap to count, you have to land in an extremely specific spot behind the finish line that's about 2 kart lengths long. If you land anywhere other than that spot, one of two things will happen. If you're lucky, the lap just won't count. But if you're unlucky, Aku Aku will always pick you up and put you back on the track over and over again, creating a huge soft lock and causing you to completely restart. A few months later, in February of 2019, he further improved upon his new shortcut by utilizing a different exploit known as the start line glitch. If you drive past the finish line while out of bounds, the game loses track of you temporarily and doesn't update the location of the finish line relative to your position. On tracks like Coco Park, for example, by going off the road, jumping towards the flat-facing side of the bleachers, and continuing to froggy until you get kicked off, the game adjusts the finish line to where you landed back on the track, giving you a huge lead by several seconds. By finishing the lap while on top of the wall, Tiziano was able to trick the game into putting the finish line much further into the track than intended, leading to lap times of only a few seconds. This was completely unheard of at the time, and showed that Papu's Pyramid, not Tiny Arena, was actually the most broken track in the entire game. Triple Tizzy is executed differently in time trials compared to proper speedruns. In a time trial, you start by driving back up the giant hill behind the finish line, performing a sharp U-turn to land back on the wall, and performing the start line glitch we mentioned earlier. But the any percent method became an entirely different beast, requiring new strategies for Tiny and Dingo. Ultimately, the easiest way to pull it off requires pulling 2 masks from the first item set, since they give you about 16 seconds of having perfect stats. I say easiest, but the reality is that the odds of getting 2 masks are only 1 in 36, leading to a microscopic 2.7% chance. As more and more players learned more about the shortcut and discovered its potential, many top players began sharing their strategies. One runner and speedrun.com moderator named Galaxian showed that it is technically possible to pull it off with just yellow fire, and a fellow player named Nyklas did this. Not long after Triple Tizzy was discovered, it became arguably the most controversial shortcut in the game's history. When I asked Alessandro about it, he said that some people were initially excited, since it brought a lot of new blood into the game and broke a lot of rules about how they thought the game had worked. It even had the potential to break the extremely stagnant and stale leaderboards that had built up over the years. But on the other side of the aisle, a lot of people weren't ready for 20 years of world records to vanish in the blink of an eye, especially not the titans who had made the competitive time trial scene into what it was prior to Alessandro's arrival. On June 6th of 2022, Hypnoshark was finally able to pull off Triple Tiziano in a single-player arcade race.
In a run. Like, the first time I get this shit in a run, it's gonna be momentous. Uh-oh. Look out. Look out! Look out, 32.4! Look out! Oh, baby! Ooh!
But as of editing this video, nobody has been able to pull it off in a complete any percent run. To absolutely nobody's surprise, the next track on the chopping block was Tiny Arena. Earlier in the video, I mentioned how players were already aware of how easy it is to treat Tiny Arena's walls as a minor obstacle. But this track was going to get picked apart like no other course in the game. In the last few years alone, multiple ultra shortcuts came about that absolutely shattered the fastest lap and 3-lap times. In March of 2020, 2 runners named Red Hot and Schwooples had found another potential no man's zone exploit on the track, where players could start the next lap while jumping over the wall. And guess who found this one? That's right, Tiziano. The first player to accomplish it in a time trial race was Corconica, who's now responsible for it being called Corky Skip. But for any percent runners, this skip is now officially dubbed TA Skip. Natty was the one who created the strategy commonly used for any percent that requires a Nitro box, which is earned by getting 10 Wumpa Fruits with a TNT box as your item. The visual indicator for where to set the Nitro is along the side of the track where these two balls meet. After placing it, you want to quickly turn around, then perform turbos into it at a specific angle, which lets you get just enough upwards momentum to clear the wall and complete the lap. Tiny Arena really is a track where luck plays a big role. By getting to first place, you're pretty much guaranteed a Nitro on the first lap. But to get the fastest time, you need 2 more Nitros by the end of the run. With only 4 item chances over the next 2 laps, your odds of getting both are just over 20%, making the RNG equal parts brutal and hilarious. According to Galaxian and HypnoShark, this shortcut was a lot like Triple Tiziano because of how polarizing it was, but it also changed how players approach the track. Due to the RNG involved with getting Nitros, how precise the Nitro box placement has to be, and the angle at which you have to approach it, his reason for why it was so divisive was that people didn't want to grind for 30 minutes just to have their run die to it. Natty himself reportedly hates the shortcut he discovered, but who could blame him? However, after Tiny Arena Skip was found, more and more shortcuts started popping up left and right. This was one of the first tracks to implement a new strategy with the turbo item, where you have to jump off a racer's head to land on the track above and complete the lap. But if jumping over walls doesn't suit your fancy, how about, I don't know, teleporting through the track? Or hell, why not jump over it entirely?
It would have as well. Wow. It actually would have.
Ultimately, for all of TA Skip's flaws, it's still a better strategy. As you can tell by the video, there's a lot of waiting around while the other racers catch up, and there isn't a guarantee you can do this multiple times per race. But knowing how dedicated the masters of this course are, there's bound to be more shortcuts found within the next few years that will break this track even further. After Tiny Arena's new notorious skip, we have... Wait a minute, this can't be right. Cortex Castle! Okay, let me explain. The track's only intended shortcut takes place as you're approaching the end. Simply jump at the corner of this ramp and turn to the left. However, there's a hidden technique that we haven't talked about that only appears in one other track in the game's adventure mode. Remember what I said earlier about the reserve system? How it's an invisible meter that keeps track of your remaining speed and counts down every frame? Well, I may have forgotten to mention something. See, by maintaining all the speed you've gotten up to this point, and jumping onto the super turbo pads at the end, you achieve
infinite power.
Okay, you don't technically have infinite speed, which is what Sappy Fire is considered, but you have in fact reached Ultimate Sacred Fire, the game's maximum speed cap. Once you've reached this level, the best way to preserve it is to refrain from doing turbos and make slight but tight adjustments to your alignment. The reason why is because if you perform any sort of boost, whether it's an MT or driving onto the turbo pad on the next lap, USF gets overwritten by whatever fire level boost that you do. For example, if you had USF and did 3 mini turbos, you'd be back down to yellow fire levels of speed. Mastering USF is a balancing act, preserving speed without overdoing it, and quickly being able to set your engines ablaze again. For the longest time, the time trials meta was built on overall optimization, mainly taking tighter corners and trying to keep Ultimate Sacred Fire for as long as possible. One of NyX's contributions to the community was a tool-assisted speedrun showing that, unlike Engine Labs, you could technically keep USF active for the final 2 laps of the race. By performing a series of precise, frame-perfect inputs and aligning yourself in just the right way, you could hug just enough of the edge of the first bridge to where USF wouldn't be overwritten. And as you can probably imagine, this tech isn't likely to be performed in a real race, and an old friend returned from the netherworld of the Force to help him find it. Additionally, in July of 2024, he made a huge breakthrough which allowed players to skip the outer walls of the castle. This shortcut marked the second of 3 tracks that utilized the new aforementioned turbo strategy. While it does hold a lot of potential, there's a lot that needs to go right in order to pull off the skip. You have to activate the turbo and gain enough height from squishing a player to clip through this downward-facing ceiling, before clipping through this wall and onto the track below. Based on some of NyX's notes, characters like Cortex have larger hitboxes that give you more height, making the trick slightly easier to perform. This shortcut saves about 5 seconds compared to Hypnova's world record run, and can only be pulled off once per race. It's yet to be implemented in a full game run, but once more viable setups for the skip and WSF are found, this track will become absolutely broken. And now we're back at Hot Air Skyway. Earlier in the video, I mentioned Thomas's shortcut that time trialers started performing at the start of the race. Even after almost 20 years, it's still impressive on its own. But on July 6th of this year, NyXx found a marginally easier way to pull it off. This was now the 3rd track that utilized turbos for performing shortcuts. Here, instead of blindly jumping off the side and hoping you have enough distance, he jumped off Purra's head instead. He landed a bit short of the front half of the ramp, but at least he didn't have to deal with any shenanigans with the fence. As a backup strategy, if it doesn't work, you'll hopefully have caught up with the other racers on lap 3 to have a second go at it. And 2 days after its discovery, Hypno was able to pull off the trick in a single-player arcade race.
I'll try it in a bunch of different ways. Listen, this is my first 10 minutes with the skip. I'm sure I'll get more accustomed to different techniques and stuff, but... Oh, oops. I misinputted so hard. Oh my god, 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 oh my god.
Overall, for Papu's Pyramid, Tiny Arena, Cortex Castle, and Hot Air Skyway, these newer shortcuts seem to be equal parts novel, useful, and brutal. But due to the sheer RNG with getting both masks for Triple Tiziano, all of the Tiny Arena Nitro placements, and the correct CPU movement to do the new Cortex Castle and Hot Air Skyway techs, I have extremely high hopes that someone will be lucky and cool-headed enough to pull all of them off in a world record run. It's pretty fair to say that right now, 5th gen console speedrunning is firmly in the midst of a golden age. The Super Mario 64 community continues to lower their times, Mario Kart 64 shortcuts have been blowing people's minds, and individuals like Dayoman continue to speedrun other classic Sony franchises like Spyro the Dragon. As of recording this video, CTR is the 5th most ran PS1 game on speedrun.com, and is easily the most ran game within the Crash Bandicoot franchise. But this begs the question, where do we go from here? When I asked Galaxian about this, he said that the game's quite stable shortcut-wise, and that any new discoveries that may happen will likely be tasks only. This reminded me a lot of the ultra shortcut revolution that Mario Kart Wii had a few years back. Back then, so many tracks had become so optimized that small improvements to track times were intermingled with task-only shortcuts being discovered every so often. Additionally, he likes that runners have understood the massive hurdles that need to be overcome in order to get onto the leaderboards. He believes that one unique aspect of CTR's movement is that it's extremely reactive. a delicate balancing act between managing your speed, your reserves, and the kinds of lines you have to take because of it. He describes it as a ball with 3 strings you have to keep as stable and efficient as possible. You create chain reactions that you have to be able to adapt to and keep up with that can have an effect on the rest of the race. However, this inherent challenge has made the game more alluring to new speedrunners than Mario Kart due to how deep and nuanced its movement truly is. Within the last few months, members of the time trials community have also been heavily researching new froggy techs that can benefit off-road heavy tracks like Mystery Caves, Dingo Canyon, Dragon Mines, and Tiger Temple. Some talented individuals recently discovered that holding X and square while frogging greatly reduces the amount of slowdown that you'd normally run into. This technique hadn't been discovered when Hypno got us world records, but I'm sure we'll see it pop up again in the future. Another tech with massive potential for lowering records that's actively being researched has to do with U-turning. While this might sound like sacrilege, if you play CTR with a controller that has the option for analog input, such as the PS1's DualShock or dual analog controller, you have the option to accelerate with the right stick by holding up and braking by holding down on it. This new method relies on holding up on the right stick while pressing square instead of holding X then square while pressing up and right at the same time. Part of the reason why it'll be so impactful in future runs is that the way to perform it is quicker and easier, especially on your fingers. Another benefit is that it'll be possible to cut off several seconds in time trials on courses like Turbo Track, where mastering U-turning is essential to get fast times. However, this creates a huge and entirely new learning curve due to the sheer amount of control you'll now have. Despite the game's age, the time trials community is still present as always. But around 5 years ago, while some of the shortcuts we mentioned previously were being theory crafted, publicized, and improved upon, something massive happened for the community that put a lot of fuel back into people's engines. Nitro fuel, if you will. It had been over a decade and a half since the game had gotten a mainline release with Crash Nitro Kart, and it was time for the franchise to return. On June 21st of 2019, NyXx Studios released Crash Team Racing Nitro Fueled for the PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and Nintendo Switch. To say that this game struck a chord with Crash Bandicoot fans would be a massive understatement. In fact, I remember literally crying tears of happiness the first time I saw the reveal trailer. Apart from the massive graphical overhaul, the inclusion of every track from CTR and Crash Tag Team Racing, online multiplayer, and the controversial microtransaction system, the biggest change was the removal of every Ultra shortcut I've talked about throughout this video. And because of the game's newer engine and rework of the reserve system, Ultra Sacred Fire was replaced with Blue Fire, which is likely even more unbalanced than its predecessor since you can easily keep it throughout both laps if you drive well enough. All things considered, Nitro Fueled has done pretty well for itself, in that it's forged its own elite league of top-level runners like Martin and Kiranavi. In terms of the online community, the game is nowhere near as populated as it used to be, which is really upsetting for people wanting more out of this classic series. There are a couple of unofficial community projects that have done more for the original than ever before, but they're also the types that I'd rather not draw the wrong kinds of eyes onto, legally speaking. Over the last 25 years, Crash Team Racing has become a top-tier title that has stood the test of time, becoming the definitive mascot racing game for the PlayStation 1. It rivals the likes of Mario Kart 64 with its alluring story mode, iconic stages, post-story mode challenges, and the wide breadth of advanced mechanics and skips. With every new discovery, the speedrunning community continues to create legends who could further change the game forever, whether it's Mario Kart 64's Weatherton or Crash Team Racing's Tiziano and NyXx. While this video showcases the current pinnacle of CTR speedrunning, the story isn't over. Who knows what other shortcuts are waiting to be unearthed, and how much faster can the game possibly get? This was the first video game that I remember playing with my cousins growing up, becoming one of several that has defined my early childhood and got me into video gaming as a hobby. It genuinely brings a tear to my eye how much of an impact that this console and this game have left on me for over 20 years. It's been an absolute honor to be a part of this community, and I cannot wait to see how low the world record can go. Thank you all so much for watching.